Thunder rolled through the dark skies, rain poured down on the streets. Apart from the occasional car, the streets were completely empty, except for a single couple. They were walking below the streetlights. They were laughing and smiling at each other. Both of them seemed a little drunk. They had something to celebrate after all. On the girl's hand was a new engagement ring. They were going to have a beautiful future together, or so they thought. Thanks to the loud rain and their own slight drunkenness, they didn't notice what was hiding in the alley they were walking past. In any other situation, they might have noticed the breathing that grew closer and louder every moment, but it would have already been too late anyway. The couple let out a final scream in their last moment, but it was barely audible due to the rain and the thunder. Their bodies were dragged away into the alley, and their blood got washed away by the rain. A few nights later, a police car pulled over at a diner. Out stepped two detectives, a young man in his early 20s, fresh from the academy, and an older, gruffer looking man in his mid-50s. "Are you sure we can just go to her again?" the young man asked. "You know how expensive she is, Chief won't be happy."
"Matt, it's our job these cases get solved. It's his job to let us do ours."
The other detective threw a cigarette he was smoking on the ground and stepped on it.
"She's our best weapon."
The detectives crossed the street and entered the diner. It was a nice, small, cozy looking place, not too different from any diner you'd find elsewhere. It wasn't particularly busy. Some seats were filled, but most were empty. In the back near a window sat a woman drinking coffee. The older detective walked straight to her, while the younger one greeted the lady behind the counter first. They both sat down in front of a mysterious woman, and without looking up from her coffee, she said, "Detectives Michael Warner and Matthew Davis, to what do I owe this pleasure?" "Hi, Emma." Matthew, the younger detective, replied. "How's the coffee?" "Good, thanks." Her voice didn't betray any emotion.
"Look, we need your help with a case."
Michael, the old detective, threw a case file on the table. "Who are you hiring, Private Detective Emma or Mental Mistress?" Without anyone touching the files, they flowed over to her and she started reading them. Matthew jumped in his seat. "I'll never get used to you doing that."
"You know that we can do the detective job."
Michael interjected.
"You are too expensive to not use your special powers."
"Well, you know that costs extra, right?" She smiled, but as quickly as the smile appeared, it also disappeared as she continued reading the files. "Damn, these are some pretty gruesome murders. I can see why you need some extra firepower."
6 murders in as many nights,"
Michael told her. "No clear connection between the victims," Matthew added. "Except the way they died, of course."
"They were torn apart,"
Emma murmured to herself. "I still think it's a rogue wolf or something," Matthew said. "A big, hungry wolf." "No, these are not wolf attacks." She laid the files back down on the table. "A bear wouldn't even leave such carnage." Michael stood up from his seat.
"So I assume this means you'll do it?"
"Yes." She grabbed her coffee again. "Just give me some time to go over all these cases and give me anything new you find." "Sure thing." Matthew shut up from his seat. "Looking forward to working with you again." "Same here, Matt." She smiled. "And Mike, you better make sure that this time I get paid on time." Michael smiled back and walked outside, quickly followed by Matt. She took another sip from her coffee and continued reading the files. While they walked to their car, the detectives could hear a call coming from it. Michael opened the door, grabbed the radio and leaned on the roof of the car.
"Yeah, what's up?"
"We got another 187 near 304 just outside the city," the radio told them.
"Alright, we'll check it out."
Mike sat down behind the wheel and Matt sat next to him. "Another one?"
"Yep, let's go."
Mike started the car. After a short drive, they saw the crime scene just next to the road. The road was flanked on both sides by a forest. Forensic investigators had already started. When the detectives stepped out of their car, Matt noticed another car on the other side of the road with its roof ripped off. He tapped Mike on his arm.
"Are you seeing this? If Chief still complains about hiring Mental Mistress after this, I don't know what would convince him."
Mike lit up another cigarette and took a large whiff.
"Still think it's just a wolf?"
Matt just stared at the destroyed car. They walked over to the crime scene. Mike leaned against a tree while talking to an investigator.
"Hi, Brian."
"Oh, hey Mike, another late night?" the investigator said without looking up at him.
"Yeah, this bastard exclusively kills at night, so all nights are late nights. This another one of his works?"
"We just started the investigation. It's too early to tell with any certainty." Mike looked over at what was left of the body.
"I think we can be pretty certain."
So, what do we know so far?" Matt went underneath the police tapes and looked around cautiously.
Well, the victim is a male of African descent, roughly in his mid-20s, who's been dead for about 3 to 5 hours. We suspect he was driving down the road when something landed on top of his car, causing him to lose control. I'm guessing that whatever landed on top of his car also ripped off the roof and killed the victim. But it's too early in the investigation to be sure.
It landed on top of the car? Matt gasped.
So it can fly? At this point, I'll believe anything.
Mike took another whiff of his cigarette. Then they heard a rustle coming from the bushes. Matt immediately pulled out his gun and pointed it at it.
Come out, with your hands in the air!
Mike put his hand on Matt's arm.
Calm down, Matt. It's a forest. Bushes rustle all the time. This kill happened hours ago. The killer is probably long gone.
Yeah, you're right. Matt lowered his gun.
But can you blame me for being a little jumpy?
The thing, however, they did not hear was the heavy breathing coming from those same bushes. The next day, Matt and Mike went to Mental Mistress's apartment. The elevator was broken as always, the halls were filthy and the lights were flickering.
You'd think she'd be able to afford a better apartment.
Matt laughed.
Considering how much we pay her each time. What can I say? Guess she just likes living small.
When they arrived at her front door, Mike knocked, but there was no response. He knocked a second time, still nothing. But right before he tried knocking a third time, the door just opened. There was nobody behind it. All the detective saw was a dark hallway with a light coming from a room at the end of it.
Hello?
Mike yelled, but he got no answer. The detectives looked at each other, pulled out their guns, and slowly made their way in. They quietly crept to the lit up room until they reached it, in which case they bursted in.
Freeze!
But in the room was nobody except for Mental Mistress sitting on the floor, cross-legged, eyes closed. Pins, notes, newspaper clippings, and parts of the police reports were floating through the room.
Emma!
Mike yelled angrily. The levitating items floated over to a messy desk and Mental Mistress stood up.
Oh, I'm sorry, detectives. I was a little distracted. Didn't you hear us yell?
Matt asked. Doing this, she pointed at the wall, asks a lot of concentration. The wall was covered in clippings and notes connected by yarn lines. In the middle of it all hung a large map of the city with locations of all the murders pinned.
I've got another one for you here.
Mike showed her the police report.
Thanks.
The report floated over to her hand and she started reading it. While she was reading, a pin floated behind her, landed on the map at the location where the last body was found. Matt walked over to the wall and started inspecting it. He looked at a picture from the wall. It was a photo of a bald man with grey skin and diseased-looking eyes, smiling.
Who is this friendly-looking fellow?
A monster, she said sternly. He was a suspect because the way he killed his victims reminded me of these murders.
Was?
Matt prodded. Making him a suspect was silly to begin with, she sighed. He is dead. I killed him.
Oh.
She pulled some papers from the report and pinned them to the wall. He had the same powers as me, and before killing his victims he would crush their bones and rip them apart from the inside. The injuries on these victims are very clearly the result of being ripped apart using knives or sharp claws, and not telekinesis.
Well, I'm glad you're not like that.
Matt laughed nervously. Yeah, she looked at the picture for a second, before going back through the files again.
So you made any progress yet?
Mike leaned against the doorframe. So the victims themselves didn't really share anything in common, apart from the fact that all their deaths shared certain characteristics. All of them died after sundown, but before the midnight, so relatively early in the night. They all had injuries consistent with sudden acceleration. The lack of precision and the ferocity of the attacks indicate to me that it probably wasn't done by someone who knew what they were doing. All the victims had various organs missing, but the one they all missed was their hearts, and the attackers seemed to have certain abilities normal people don't, like super speed and strength. Mental Mistress was pacing through the room like she was mostly talking to herself.
Most of that we already knew or could have guessed ourselves.
Mike jabbed.
What else you got?
She stopped walking and looked at the map one more time. Wait, what time did the last victim die?
About 5 minutes before 8,
Matt told her. The earliest death. She started going through the files again.
That's it.
If you look at the time each one of them died and how far away from the forest they were.
The later they died, the further away they were from the forest,
Mike murmured.
That means her killer's in the forest?
Matt exclaimed. Not just in the forest. Mental Mistress smiled. I can pinpoint it to somewhere here. The group of pins shot over to the map and formed a circle in the middle of the forest.
If we get a search party ready, we might be able to find that bastard before nightfall.
Mike stopped leaning against the doorframe and visibly looked excited.
Let's go!
Matt yelled. They ran outside and jumped into the car. They drove to the forest and Mike called for a search party to join them. They got out of their car as soon as they reached the forest.
We should wait for the other cops before we go in,
Mike said as he looked at his watch, but Mental Mistress was already walking into the forest. Matt tried to go after her, but Mike grabbed his arm.
Don't worry about her. She's a big girl. You saw those bodies. That's not something we can go up against without backup. I saw the bodies. That's why I can't let her go alone. Matt ripped his arm from Mike's grip and ran after her. Emma, wait! Mike sighed and followed them. After about an hour, other cops started showing up and helped with the search. There was even a helicopter, but it wasn't much use due to the thick foliage. However, it was now virtually impossible to leave the search area without a police officer knowing about it. The search went on for a couple of hours, even after darkness fell over the forest. There were several white streaks coming from the flashlights of the officers, penetrating the now oppressive blackness of the forest. The only audible sound was the wind rustling through the leaves and the helicopter. Not a word was exchanged between the cops, the detectives, or Mistress. Then there was an agonizing scream. One of the flashlights fell to the ground, but as suddenly as it started, the scream stopped. Mistress and the detectives gave each other a short surprised glance and ran over to the dropped light, still beaming into the forest. The entire forest floor was covered in dead leaves, except for a straight line next to the flashlight, as if a strong gust of wind had carved its way through it. There was no sign of the officer. A new scream echoed through the forest, and another flashlight dropped to the ground. And then another. And another. And another. One by one, each flashlight dropped, accompanied with a harrowing scream. Some officers tried firing their guns, but to no avail. Mistress and the detectives pushed their backs against each other and pointed their guns and flashlights out. There's no pattern, Mike yelled. One moment it happens here, the other it happens there. There are multiple, Matt cried out. All officers to our location, Mistress commanded. We must all stick together. But by the time she was done talking, the last flashlight fell. By now a strong wind had picked up. It felt like a large storm raging between the trees. The skies were still clear and the helicopter didn't seem to have any trouble. But as I looked up at the helicopter, a large shadow shot from between the trees, hit it, causing it to crash and explode once it hit the ground. The wind now really started picking up. It felt like a small tornado howled around them. Leaves flew around them, small twigs broke from the trees and dirt raced from the ground. They covered their faces to protect from the debris, but then the wind stopped. All the leaves, dirt and twigs fell back to the ground and it was silent again. Silent, except for heavy breathing. Mistress could even feel it on her face, and when she looked forward she saw large, drooling white fangs. The canines were the size of kitchen knives. Mixed with the drool was large amounts of blood dripping to the ground, and the breath smelled like that of a dog who had just eaten rotten meat. Without thinking, she used her powers to push it away from her, and as it was launched away, large claws swiped in front of her face, barely missing, but it was clear it tried to claw at her. It got flung through multiple trees and landed with a loud thud. Was that the killer? Matt was visibly terrified. Mike could also not hide his worry, but Mistress's face did not betray much emotion other than determination, even though she also seemed to be sweating. No doubt about it. She ran to the location it landed, but it was already gone. The detectives followed her. How could it be gone? Matt yelled. It just landed. I don't think there's multiple. Mistress looked into the forest. It's just really fast. We need reinforcement. Mike was stern but visibly shaken. Mistress started inspecting the ground. We already had reinforcements. Anyone else would just be more meat in a grinder. Like we are? Matt's face was as pale as the moon and sweat dripped down his cheeks. Then he heard a twig snap and rapidly fired 12 shots where the sound came from. Mike sighed and put his hand on Matt's shoulder. Listen, Matt, you are a brilliant detective and your future is bright. A forest in the middle of the night is no place for you to die. What? Matt was confused. You still have a life in front of you. You have friends, family, burgeoning career. You have to protect that. You should go home. What about you guys? What about the monster? Emma can take care of the killer, and I'm an old geezer. Don't worry, we'll be fine. From where they were standing they could see their car. Matt looked over to it and hesitated. He made a single step towards the car, but then he stopped. I'm not going, Mike. If I left and something happened to you, I'd never be able to look myself in the mirror again. Besides, that thing can eat you when you're in the car, so the safest place is probably near someone with superpowers. He looked over at Mistress. But it's not. If you two are done, I know where it went. Mistress said sternly. Mike tried to say one last thing, but stopped himself. There's a trail in the leaves. Mistress walked into the forest and the others followed. The trail led them to a small hill covered in leaves, but it ended right at its foot. Is that it? Matt sighed. Is the trail dead? No. Mistress lifted her arms and raised all the leaves of the hill, revealing a tunnel. They could all stand up straight in the tunnel and also reach the ceiling with their hands. The smell coming from it was horrendous, a mixture of rotten eggs, rotting meat, and feces. They each covered their noses and even their mouths to not smell it, but it helped little. As they went in, they saw claw marks on the walls and ceiling. The floor was soggy as if they were walking on wet grass, but there was no grass. A faint crying could be heard deep from within the tunnel.
The claw marks slowly started to look more like letters, and those letters started to form words. Most were just single words or outright gibberish, but some seemed like warnings. Stay out. He will come. There's no escape. Or please for help. Save me. Help me. Don't let him take me. Eventually they came to a large room at the end of the tunnel. There lay a man, naked in a fetal position, in a puddle of blood. He looked like a skeleton, wrapped in skin. He was the one crying.
Oh, why am I here? It's not my time.
Mike rushed over to him. Sir, are you alright? The man barely acknowledged his presence.
There's no sun. There should be sun.
Matt scanned the room with his flashlight and found a pile of bodies. They were the bodies of the other officers. Their stomachs were ripped open and their guts were spread out all over the floor.
Oh my god.
Matt could barely say anything before vomiting. Mike helped the man stand up and checked if he was injured. What's your name, sir? The man stopped crying, but he was still audibly shaken. Cameron Hemmings. Even though he must have been in the darkness for a while, he didn't react to the flashlights that were now shining on him. Everything will be alright, Cameron. Mistress walked over to him. We'll get you out of here. Cameron looked at her. No, don't get me out of here. I must say, you must get out of here. It's not safe. We know it's not safe. That's why you need to come with us, Mike barked. Let's go. Cameron dashed to the other side of the room. No, please, you must understand. He can come back any minute. I'm not supposed to be out at night. That's his time. That was our deal. His bony hands covered his face. When he comes back, you will all be dead. Just like them. He pointed at the pile of bodies. Who is he? Mistress knelt before him. He is coming. Cameron stared into the blackness of the tunnel. It was a trap. They immediately pointed their guns and flashlights at the tunnel, but nothing came. Then the man collapsed to the floor and started convulsing spastically. The man tried to help, but Cameron threw him across the room. Cameron's bones started crackling, his arms became longer and thick fur grew all over his body. His ears became pointier, his teeth sharpened, and his mouth protruded out of his face. After a howl so loud they all had to cover their ears, the transformation was complete. Where Cameron was just a few moments ago now stood a large hulking beast. Its fur was as black as the night, its eyes glowing in the darkness. Its legs and head were those of a large wolf, and its arms resembled those of a muscular man with claws on each finger. It was hunched over and like a gorilla stood on its knuckles. Standing like this, its mouth was at the same height as Mistress's head. It was breathing heavily and its drool dripped on the floor. For a moment, nothing happened. They just stared at each other. Until almost faster than the eye could see, the werewolf dashed over to Mike. He stood there, frozen. It tried to swipe its massive claws at him, but Matt tackled Mike to the ground just in time for it to miss them. It tried to swipe a second time but froze right as its claws touched Matt's cheek. Mistress was using her powers to keep it in place. The monster growled. Both detectives immediately stood up and started shooting at it. The flashes of their guns lit up the entire room. After emptying their clips, they pointed their flashlights at it. It was still breathing. It wasn't even wounded. At its feet was a pile of dented bullets. Run! Mistress barked. She was struggling heavily to keep it still. Matt tried to say something, but she interrupted him. I don't care! Go! The detectives sprinted away as fast as they could. After they were far enough, she raised her other hand and collapsed the exit of the room. Now it was just her and the monster in a room only lit by a single flashlight and the wolf's eyes. He broke free and charged at her, jumped over it and pushed its face into the ground. Then she lifted it up and threw it against the wall. It growled and quickly dug up a cloud of dirt, limiting her vision even more. Then it tackled her, slamming her into a wall. He grabbed her by her throat and threw her against the ceiling. He jumped on top of her and tried to bite her face. She tried to keep it away as hard as she could, but the teeth edged closer and closer. She couldn't throw it off, it had anchored its claws deep into the ground. She used the telekinesis to direct all the floating dirt in the room into the monster's eyes. It let out a cry and stumbled back. It grabbed the officers' bodies and started throwing them at her. She dodged at first, but noticed that the body basically shattered against the wall with a horrific squashing and crunching noise. So she used her powers to catch them out of the air and carefully laid them back on the ground. The monster got frustrated and charged at her again. It tried to claw at her, but she caught it, twisted the arm, and there was a loud snap. She had broken its arm. It let out a painful cry, and before Mistress could properly react, its other arm had clawed her stomach. She dropped her flashlight and the werewolf stomped on it, shattering it completely. It was now completely dark except for the two pale lights of the wolf's eyes. Mistress was bleeding heavily. It got ready to claw at her again, but she just sat down. It paused for a moment, confused. But then its unbroken arm twisted unnaturally, followed by another loud crunch.
It tried to run away, but before it could go anywhere, its left foot raised in the air and snapped sideways. Then the same happened to the other foot. The creature was wailing in pain, sounding like a beaten dog. It was lying on the floor and couldn't move anymore. Then she lifted it in the air in front of her. It started howling and crying in pain. You could feel that it was being ripped apart from the inside. It tried looking at her. It was almost as if it was begging for mercy. Mental Mistress could almost see Cameron's eyes appear behind the glowing lights. Then she saw a flash of the grey-skinned man with diseased eyes and immediately let go. It collapsed to the floor but wasn't moving anymore. The lights were out and there was no more breathing. She was now alone in the darkness. She tried to stand up but collapsed back to the floor, unconscious. Later she woke up in a hospital bed. Her stomach hurt and she could barely get up. "Good morning, Emma." Mike was sitting on a little chair reading a newspaper. "Mike?" she smiled. "What happened?" "Well, after you sent us away and closed yourself up, we ran to the car. There we called for help, and by the time the others showed up, there were no more noises coming from the room anymore. So we assumed the fight was over. We cleared away the rubble and found you next to that bastard all passed out. Lucky we did too. If we'd found you minutes later, you'd probably have bled out. So I opted to stay here for tonight, to keep an eye on you." "You stayed here all night?" She laughed. "Oh, don't sweat it. I had nowhere to go, and I wasn't sleeping after that." Mike seemed a little uncomfortable in his chair. "You did good out there, kid." "Did I?" She looked away from Mike. "Are you kidding me?" He laughed. "You killed something in a one-on-one fight that killed 12 cops." She stayed silent for a moment. "So, where's Matt?" "I brought him home. He's probably still asleep on the couch." "Of course," she laughed. "Next time you see him, tell him I'm fine." "I will." Mike stood up from his chair. "Well, I'm glad to see you're fine. I'm about to collapse. I better get home." He started walking to the door, but Mental Mistress stopped him. "You better make sure I get paid on time." She smiled. Mike smiled back and walked out. Over at the morgue, they were investigating the body of the werewolf. One diener handed the report to another. "What a remarkable specimen. It appears to have suffered some minor injuries on a few of its internal organs, but other than that, its body is in perfect shape." Both discussed further what the report said and walked out of the room. The werewolf's body was still lying motionless on the table.